Welcome, brave souls, to another journey into darkness. If you value your sanity, or what's left of it, subscribe now and prepare yourself for more bone-chilling stories that haunt the night. Go ahead, hit that like button if you dare, and share this video with others who crave the unsettling touch of fear. Every like, every share, draws us deeper into the unknown. So lock your doors, dim the lights, and let the terror begin.
Depths of dread. The hollow peaks rose above the horizon, their jagged silhouettes stark against the pale morning sky. Even from a distance, the mountain looked intimidating, its rugged cliffs and deep crevices creating an unwelcoming landscape. For the group of 5 climbers standing at the trailhead, it was precisely the kind of challenge they sought. Mark stood at the front, stretching out his shoulders and rolling his neck to ease the tension. He adjusted the straps of his pack and took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. "All right, everyone," he said with a grin. "Let's make this climb one for the books." Rachel, Mark's girlfriend, shot him a smile as she double-checked her harness. Though she shared Mark's enthusiasm, a part of her was unnerved by the tales associated with the hollow peaks. Local legend told of a group of miners who had disappeared there in the late 1800s, leaving only one survivor, a man who had been found half-mad and raving about things that climbed in the dark. Beside her, Tom was already chatting with Laura, his girlfriend. He had a cocky, adrenaline-seeking attitude that often got him into trouble. "This place has a creepy reputation, huh?" Tom said, his voice full of casual excitement. "All those ghost stories, miners getting swallowed by the mountain and all that." Laura adjusted her climbing gloves and glanced up at the looming rock face. "Maybe that's why no one's been here in a while," she murmured. "But I guess we'll make it up just fine." "Exactly," Mark said. "There's nothing here except rock and wind. We'll be the first to scale this section in weeks. Think of the bragging rights." Eddie, who stood a few feet away, stared at the mountain's craggy surface with an intense expression. The quietest of the group, he was also the most experienced climber. He'd never shared the others' casual attitude toward nature's dangers. "We'd better get going," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's a long climb, and the weather can change fast." Mark nodded, giving his friend a reassuring pat on the back. "Don't worry, Eddie. We're gonna be fine." But even as he spoke, he couldn't help but feel a slight chill run down his spine. The hollow peaks had a way of getting under your skin, even before you set foot on its slopes. With their gear secured and nerves steeled, the 5 climbers began their ascent, unaware that they were already being watched by something older and darker than the mountain itself. The climb started smoothly, with the group navigating narrow ledges and scaling the initial rock face. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced across the jagged cliffs. As they climbed higher, the scenery became more breathtaking, with the surrounding landscape falling away below them and the horizon stretching out in all directions. The usual banter and camaraderie helped dispel the cold morning air, but an unspoken tension lingered among them. Halfway up, Tom paused to catch his breath, his eyes drawn to a jagged outcropping ahead. "Hey, look at that!" he called out, pointing to a section of rock that jutted from the cliff face. Its shape was eerie and unsettling, resembling a distorted face frozen in a silent scream, its mouth agape and eyes hollow. "Pretty creepy, huh?" Rachel glanced at the rock formation, her skin prickling at the sight. The resemblance to a human face was uncanny, and the way the shadows fell across the carved-looking features gave it a lifelike appearance. "Yeah, creepy," she murmured, tightening her grip on the rope. She tried to laugh it off, but the sight stirred something uneasy within her. Eddie, climbing a few feet below, was the next to notice something strange. As he moved to the side to adjust his footing, his hand brushed against an old piton driven into the rock. The metal was rusted, and the attached rope was frayed and worn. "Check this out," he said, pulling it free and showing it to the others. "This thing must have been here for decades." Mark leaned in for a closer look, his brow furrowing. "That's odd," he said. "We didn't see any records of past climbs on this route. Maybe it's been abandoned for a reason. Probably left by some other climbers who didn't make it," Tom joked, but the laughter that followed felt forced. The mountain's reputation loomed large in their minds, and even the smallest suggestion of danger was enough to unsettle them. As they continued upward, the temperature dropped noticeably. The higher they climbed, the colder the air became, and a light breeze whispered across the rock face. It seemed to carry faint, unintelligible sounds with it, almost like voices. The whispers drifted up from below, persistent enough to be unsettling, yet too indistinct to make out any words. Rachel glanced down, her eyes scanning the shadows that pooled in the crevices beneath them. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "I know it's just the wind," she said, "but it almost sounds like whispering." Mark laughed, though there was a slight edge to his voice. "You're just letting the stories get to you." Eddie said nothing, but his jaw was clenched as he listened to the wind's eerie psalm. The ledge was narrow, with a sheer drop to one side, and a wall of rugged stone to the other. As they climbed, the group had to move in single file, carefully maneuvering along the uneven path. Laura was the first to stumble. Her foot slipped on a patch of loose gravel, and she let out a startled cry as her body lurched sideways. Her arm flailed, desperately reaching for a handhold. Mark was closest and lunged forward, grabbing her arm just in time to pull her back onto the ledge. She clung to him, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her face pale. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought I was gone." Mark gave her a reassuring squeeze before helping her regain her footing. "You're okay," he said softly. "Just take it slow." Rachel watched the scene with wide eyes, her heart pounding. Her mind flashed back to the old piton they'd found earlier. If someone had fallen here before, she shook the thought from her mind and focused on steadying her breathing. Eddie's gaze shifted up the trail, where he spotted a dark opening in the rock face ahead. It appeared to be a cave entrance, partially obscured by shadows and weathered stone. "Let's rest there for a bit," he suggested. "It's sheltered from the wind, and we could all use a break." Reluctantly, the others agreed. They made their way to the cave entrance, each climber keeping a wary eye on the rocky ledge below. As they stepped inside, the air temperature dropped even further, the cold biting into their skin. They turned on their headlamps, illuminating the interior. The light swept across rough, uneven walls lined with peculiar carvings. The carvings weren't the familiar petroglyphs they had seen on other climbs. These were grotesque, chaotic, and deeply unsettling, depicting twisted figures locked in contorted poses, their faces etched with expressions of agony and fear. The carvings seemed almost alive, the shadows cast by their headlamps giving the impression that the figures were moving, writhing against the stone. Rachel's skin prickled as she walked closer to the wall, tracing the outline of one of the carvings with her flashlight. "What kind of people would make something like this?" she asked, her voice hushed. Before anyone could answer, a low rumble echoed through the cave, and the ground beneath them trembled. A deep, shuddering groan reverberated through the stone, and suddenly, a cascade of rocks fell from the cave entrance, sealing it shut. Dust and debris filled the air, making it difficult to see or breathe. Panic gripped them as the reality of the situation set in. "We're trapped," Laura cried, her voice shrill with terror. Eddie's expression remained calm, but there was a tension in his posture. "There has to be another exit," he said. "We need to keep moving deeper. Staying here isn't an option." The passage ahead was narrow and sloped steeply downward, winding through the mountain's interior like a coiled serpent. The group hesitated for a moment, but the choking dust and sealed entrance left them little choice. They pressed onward, their headlamps cutting through the darkness, casting long shadows on the walls as they moved deeper into the unknown. The air grew colder with every step they took, and the unsettling carvings on the walls became more frequent. What had started as abstract shapes now took on grotesque forms, depicting scenes of torment that made their skin crawl. The figures seemed to writhe and shift under the light, their faces contorted in pain and horror. As the group ventured further, the passages twisted and turned, splitting off into multiple directions. Rachel's fear grew with each step, her anxiety compounding as the sense of isolation deepened. The oppressive darkness pressed in around them, and the carvings seemed to leer at her from the walls, their grotesque expressions twisting in the flickering light. It was as if the stone itself was alive, bearing witness to some ancient suffering that had left its mark on the very rock. She reached out and gripped Mark's arm, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We need to find a way out of here." This place. It feels wrong. Mark nodded, but his usual confidence was waning. He glanced back at Eddie, whose face was set in a hard expression. Eddie, you've done cave climbing before, right? You think one of these passages leads out? Eddie surveyed the dark tunnels that branched off in multiple directions. We stick to one path, he said firmly. No splitting up. We'll take the one that seems to be going upward. If we follow the incline, we should eventually find an exit. But as they proceeded deeper, the whispers returned, this time louder and more distinct. It wasn't just the wind or the creaking of ancient rock. It was as if the mountain itself was murmuring to them, its voice rising and falling in an unsteady rhythm. The whispers seemed to echo from all directions, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. Mark thought he heard his own name, whispered faintly, carried on the cold air. He turned his head quickly, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Only shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of the light. Let's keep moving, he said, trying to mask the unease in his voice. Desperation clawed at them as they trekked deeper into the labyrinthine network of tunnels. The walls seemed to close in tighter, and the narrow passages became more twisted and irregular, as if they were navigating the veins of a living creature. With every step, the group's nerves frayed further, their breaths becoming shallow and ragged. The air was heavy, as though laden with the weight of 1,000 buried secrets. Rachel lagged behind, feeling a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She swore she could hear someone breathing just behind her, each exhalation slow and raspy. She turned quickly, her flashlight beam sweeping over the walls. The carvings stared back at her, their faces frozen in twisted agony. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I didn't hear anything," Mark replied, though his expression suggested otherwise. As they rounded a bend in the passage, a sudden scream pierced the darkness. It was Tom's voice, full of raw terror. "Help! Something's got me!" His cry echoed through the tunnels, followed by a frantic scraping sound, then silence. The group froze, their hearts hammering in their chests. "Tom!" Laura shouted, her voice cracking as she stumbled forward in the direction of the sound. But there was no response, only the oppressive silence that followed. Mark and Eddie rushed toward where they had last seen Tom, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they ran. They reached a narrow crevice where his voice had come from, but there was no sign of him. Just a faint smudge on the wall, like a handprint smeared in dust. Mark's pulse raced as he frantically searched the ground for any sign of his friend. "He was just here," Laura sobbed, her panic mounting. "He was right behind me." Eddie stepped closer to the crevice, his flashlight revealing what lay beyond, a sheer drop into darkness. It seemed to plunge endlessly into the depths below. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered. "If he fell, we would have heard him hit something." A cold dread settled over them. Whatever had taken Tom, it had done so silently and completely. The remaining four stumbled back to regroup, their breaths coming in rapid, shallow gasps. The realization that they were not alone, that something was hunting them, gripped them with a terror that made the darkness feel alive. The whispers, once distant, were now louder and more coherent, weaving together in an unintelligible chorus. It was as though the voices were urging them deeper into the mountain, coaxing them toward some unseen abyss. Mark's face was pale, his hands trembling as he gripped his flashlight. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice barely steady. "We need to find an exit, any exit." Eddie nodded, his own composure strained. "There's an incline over there," he said, gesturing to a passage that seemed to slope upward. "It might lead us out." As they hurried toward the passage, Rachel felt a sudden chill pass through her, like icy fingers trailing along her spine. She spun around, her flashlight catching a glimpse of something, a figure, just at the edge of her vision. It flickered like a shadow, there one moment and gone the next. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice thin and desperate. Before anyone could respond, a dark shape lunged from the shadows. It was formless, a shifting mass of darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe. It swept through the tunnel with a terrible speed, and for a brief, horrifying moment, they could see faces in the dark, contorted and wailing. The thing rushed past them, leaving a chill in its wake that cut to the bone. It didn't touch them, but it left behind a lingering sense of dread, as if it had marked them for something yet to come. Their legs burned with exertion as they scrambled up the sloping passage, their fear driving them forward. The tunnel walls grew narrower, pressing in on either side until they had to move single file. The air was damp and frigid, every breath escaping as a cloud of mist. As they neared the top of the passage, the faint outline of a vertical shaft came into view. It was narrow and jagged, leading upward to a small patch of dim light, a potential exit. Mark's heart leaped at the sight. "We're almost out," he shouted, though his voice echoed back at him, swallowed by the stone. "Go, Rachel. You first," Eddie urged, helping her up toward the shaft. Rachel grasped the rocks, pulling herself up, her hands scraped and bleeding. Mark followed close behind, his breath coming in desperate gasps. As Laura began to climb, Eddie stayed at the base, his eyes fixed on the darkness below. The whispers were louder now, a chaotic blend of voices that seemed to surge closer. A figure began to form in the shadows, its shape shifting and flickering like smoke. It seemed to grow larger as it approached, the darkness thickening around it. Eddie turned back to the others. "Keep going," he yelled. "Don't look back. I'll hold it off." He picked up a loose rock and hurled it toward the advancing darkness, his voice rising in a furious cry. The darkness surged forward, and Eddie's scream echoed through the shaft. It was a scream of defiance, but it soon twisted into a maddening laughter, low and hollow at first, then growing louder and more distorted. The sound reverberated through the tunnels, as though the mountain itself was laughing with him. It was his voice, but warped and unnatural, like he was laughing at some terrible joke that only he could understand. Mark and Rachel emerged from the shaft into the light of day, gasping for air. The sudden brightness stung their eyes, and the chill of the mountain wind bit into their skin. They collapsed onto the rocky ground, their limbs heavy and aching, bodies trembling from exhaustion and terror. The escape had been frantic, and it was only now that the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. "Eddie," Rachel whispered, staring back at the narrow shaft. "He didn't make it." The final sounds of his distorted laughter still echoed in her mind, twisting her stomach into knots. Mark's face was pale and drawn, his eyes hollow. We have to go," he said, his voice barely more than a murmur. "We can't stay here. We need to get away from this place." But as they scrambled to their feet, their legs felt weak and unsteady, as if the mountain had drained them of their strength. Laura stumbled out of the cave last, her eyes vacant and glassy, her face an expression of detached horror. She had been nearly catatonic since Tom's disappearance, and as she stood there, her mouth moved without sound, forming words that never fully came out. Her fingers twitched at her sides, and she kept looking back toward the darkness, as though she could still see him somewhere in the shadows. They made their way down the mountainside, the rough terrain digging into their feet, their bodies moving on autopilot. The sky had darkened considerably, the sun nearly hidden behind thick clouds, and it felt as though time had warped inside the mountain. Days stretched into moments, hours compressed into an eternity. The hike back was a blur, their minds numbed by the ordeal, the horror still too raw and real to process. Rachel collapsed once more as they reached the flatter ground near the base. Her legs buckled, sending her to her knees. She clutched her shoulder, where the strange, cold handprint had formed earlier, rubbing it as if trying to wipe away the stain. But the mark remained, a faint but undeniable outline, almost like a bruise. It throbbed dully, and the chill it left behind seemed to seep into her bones. No matter how hard she tried to steady her breathing, her body remained in the grip of a profound, icy fear that refused to let her go. Mark helped her up, his own hands shaking. He had been the rock for the group, the one who pushed them to keep going. But now the terror had left him frayed at the edges. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every sound, a whisper from the dark tunnels. Eddie's laughter haunted him the most, unhinged, echoing endlessly in his mind. He struggled to recall the moment Eddie had decided to stay behind, to confront the darkness, but the memory was a blur. He couldn't be sure whether Eddie had sacrificed himself to save them, or if something had already claimed him before the final moments. Mark kept hearing Eddie's voice in his head, but twisted and taunting, as if mocking their escape. Laura trailed behind them as they continued down the trail. Her muttering had grown louder, more frantic. She talked about the carvings and the faces in the walls, as if they had spoken to her, revealed something terrible that she couldn't fully comprehend. "They're still in there," she whispered, eyes wide. "They're still in the dark, waiting. They're part of the stone now, but they're still alive. I can see them moving." Her words descended into a series of low murmurs, and her vacant stare remained fixed on the mountainside. It was clear that whatever Laura had seen or experienced, it had shattered something inside her, leaving her mind fragmented and haunted by the darkness. As they reached the trailhead, Rachel and Mark spotted another group of climbers preparing to ascend. They laughed and chatted, oblivious to the horror that lurked in the hollow peaks. Mark opened his mouth to warn them, to say something, anything, but his voice caught in his throat. The words felt heavy and distant, as though the mountain had taken his voice just as it had taken their friends. He stood there, frozen, while the new climbers geared up, laughing and oblivious. Rachel grabbed Mark's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Let's go," she whispered. "We can't. There's nothing we can say." She pulled him away, and together they turned from the mountain, leaving the trail and the new climbers behind. As they descended further from the peaks, the whispers that had haunted them seemed to fade, though not completely. There was still a faint murmur, barely audible, as if the hollow peaks were calling to them from a great distance. Laura continued mumbling as they walked, her hands clutched tightly to her chest. Her words made little sense now, a jumbled mess of half-formed phrases about faces, voices, and the dark. It wasn't long before she fell silent altogether, her expression growing emptier with each passing step. By the time they reached the base, she was almost completely unresponsive, staring off into space with a hollow look that mirrored the very mountain itself. In the days that followed, the climbers struggled to return to normal life. But the ordeal had left scars far deeper than any physical wound. Rachel went to see a doctor about the hand-shaped mark on her shoulder, but no medical explanation could be found. The bruise faded with time, but the chill remained, resurfacing whenever she was alone or in darkness. Nightmares plagued her sleep, visions of the carvings and the dark shapes that twisted in the mountain's depths. She woke often with the sensation of being touched, the phantom hand gripping her shoulder, and an unshakable feeling that the darkness had followed her home. Mark avoided talking about the climb. He stayed away from the climbing community, and when friends asked about his latest adventure, he dismissed the questions with vague responses, too haunted by the memories to relive them. He could still hear Eddie's laughter in quiet moments, a disembodied mockery that drifted through his mind like a ghost. Sometimes he even saw Eddie's reflection in mirrors or windows, just for a split second, as though his friend's spirit was still lingering in the periphery of his vision. Laura's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her ramblings grew more intense, and she became consumed by paranoia. She spoke of seeing faces in walls and hearing voices in the dark, her hands trembling uncontrollably whenever she recounted what had happened in the caves. Eventually, her family admitted her to a psychiatric facility where doctors struggled to understand her fractured state. She was often found staring at the walls, tracing shapes with her fingers, as though trying to replicate the carvings they had seen in the caves, whispering to herself about things that climbed in the dark. For the three of them, life after the hollow peaks became a waking nightmare, a constant struggle to separate reality from the horrors that had taken root in their minds. The mountain loomed in the distance, a dark and imposing silhouette on the horizon. It was a reminder of what they had faced and what they had lost, and a part of them always felt as if the hollow peaks were still watching, still waiting for them to return. And every so often, on quiet nights when the wind was just right, they thought they could hear faint whispers drifting down from the peaks. Eddie's laughter, distant and warped, as though the mountain itself was calling them back.